Hi everybody and welcome to Net English Route 2 Developing English. This is the second follow-up session and today's focus is interpreting Shakespearean drama and how to teach it. I'm Ashleigh Potts, Director of Subject. So today's session is all about the application of potential teaching and learning strategies. And the overview of the session looks like this. The first thing we'll do is we will recap some of the key details of Joe's incredibly detailed session on Not the Bard, Shakespeare and his big ideas, and think about where that applies to our Net English curriculum. I've then broken different strategies down again into building blocks, and we'll talk you through each of those and then give you a modelled approach so you can think about how you could apply that to your current classroom with your particular classes at the moment. So we'll look at the journey of a characters, we'll look at symbolic settings, we'll look at the threading of symbolism throughout Shakespeare's plays, we'll look at potential and contrasting characters, how to do language analysis, as we all know that is a potential barrier and obstacle that pupils from year 7 right through to year 13 struggle with, and look at transferable phrases. So, Shakespeare. The first thing that I'd like to reinforce from Joe's earlier presentation that I think is really important is making sure that we do emphasise the fact that Shakespeare was an actual human and not this establishment within English literature, even though he is. But the idea that Shakespeare was a man with a voice, he did have flaws, but more importantly, he used his voice for a message, for a commentary on humanity and our society. And through his drama in particular, it was very apparent what Shakespeare was valuing or criticising about the world that he was living in. There was often a political stance to that, but really important that Shakespeare's plays were an opportunity for Shakespeare to construct a text through voices of his characters and the choices that his characters make. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we think about the journey of characters throughout Shakespearean drama. So those of you who checked out my follow-up session on poetry last week, you will recognise this slide. And the reason why I included it is because this idea of a spider's web of well-crafted perfection really applies to Shakespearean drama as well as poetry. Like we all know, a lot of Shakespearean drama, a lot of Shakespeare's plays are written in the form of poetry. So just like poetry, there are concepts, there is language analysis, the symbolic settings. But in addition to poetry, and what we are going to spend some time exploring, the idea of character journeys and character arcs, key and subtle moments, parallel and contrasting characters, and transferable phrases. But I've included the same diagram because I want you to remember that this spider's web is something where everything is connected. If you pulled one element of the spider's web, the full web would move with it. So just like if you were exploring a character within a Shakespeare play, you could make links to every other element of the well-crafted piece of perfection. So where is Shakespeare in our Net English curriculum? Well, in year 7 and 8, it's the first thing that our pupils study in term 1A. And in year 7, it is A Midsummer's Night's Dream. And then in year 8, it moves on to Othello, which is a challenging text. And the reason why those texts were chosen is the idea that starting with the comedy, then leading on to the tragedy. Throughout our academies at Key Stage 4, the most common play that is studied is Macbeth, followed by Romeo and Juliet, where a few schools still choose to do that text, and rightly so. Sorry. So the idea being that Shakespearean drama is in Term 1A for Year 7 and 8 because our curriculum is built on a chronological literary canon, so to speak, but also it feeds in really nicely to poetry. Backwards and forwards planning, again I'll reiterate this idea that it leads itself beautifully to the deepening of a skill, not necessarily understanding a particular text, but the deepening of how to analyse a text and how to access characters and how to think about conceptual ideas. So just like poetry, the first building block of my teaching within a classroom for a Shakespearean drama would be to introduce my pupils to a conceptual approach. And the reason being is, for a lot of our pupils, Shakespeare or a play seems absolutely massive. And it's the idea of chunking it down from the start and being able to say, right, we're going to start doing this play. It's about these big ideas, and being able from the start to introduce these big ideas with our pupils, and through building up a semantic field, familiarise our pupils with those big ideas to enable them to be able to track those big ideas and use the vocabulary that they are continually building to be able to explore those ideas. Okay, so over to our first model, and the play that I've chosen to model how to do this is Shakespeare's Macbeth. The reason being, the majority of our academies do teach this text, and for those of you who are currently teaching Year 7 and Year 8, in particular for Year 8, there are incredibly intrinsic links between Othello and Macbeth. So these ideas, like our curriculum is backwards and forwards, these ideas are transferable across all of the elements of Shakespeare. So, for example, I might display this image on the board before teaching Macbeth and saying, right, we are going to teach a play called Macbeth, and this play deals with all of these ideas. And it's this idea of exposing our pupils to these big ideas in literature. Let's face it, there is no piece of literature that does not deal with power, conflict, love or relationships. These are just specific elements of those 4 key concepts that run through everything and run through our curriculum. And after exposing our pupils to those big ideas, I'd zoom in on some in particular and I'd build up a semantic field. Now, the way that I do this would completely depend on the class's ability, the class's confidence. It may be that we build up a semantic field together for one concept and then it's collaborative and then it leads to independence. But the main important area of this is that the semantic field is then reviewed and reinforced throughout future teaching and learning. So for example, if we take the concept power, a semantic field I might build around that is, okay, physical prowess on the battlefield, agility, nobility, determination. But then I also will want to introduce the pupils to the idea of power being abused. So the mistreatment of others, tyranny, despotism. Moving on to deceit, I would want my pupils to be able to use the following words and phrases: manipulation, nobility, being patriotic, being truthful, being loyal. And by approaching Shakespeare from a conceptual and a semantic field approach, when you then go into the play and meet the characters, pupils will feel a lot more confident because they've already been exposed to these big ideas and they will have the words at their disposal to be able to make links about the characters. My second building block of teaching Shakespearean drama is, once I've familiarised my pupils with the big concepts behind the play, we then need to be looking at a character's journey. And all pieces of literature include a protagonist who goes on a journey, who goes on an experience, who changes, develops, and ultimately ends up at a different place. That's what a piece of literature is. And it's really important for pupils to be aware that all of Shakespeare's plays, there's at least one protagonist who goes on a journey. And it's a nice way to chunk down the play for pupils as well, and for them to be able to think about the play in a holistic manner and think about a particular action as foreshadowing to something that happens later on in the play, or identifying an action and think, oh well, actually that links back to something, it contrasts, it's different. And this is the visual representation that I always use to my pupils. So this idea of a roadmap which has twists and turns that represents the character's journey throughout the scenes and the acts of a play. So this is being directly lifted from a bell task that I did with a Year 11 group at Walbottle this week on Macbeth, where they could use their neat notebooks if they would like, but they had to identify what are the key moments in the play. And what I mean by key moments are really pivotal moments, key things that we've got to talk about if you're writing an essay on Macbeth. So for example, meeting the witches for the first time, the reference to the thunder, lightning, awe and rain, that idea of the storm being a symbolic metaphor for the chaos and destruction that's going to come to Scotland. Then hearing about Macbeth, the brave, loyal warrior, and at this moment in the play he's valued, and we hear about him using a long sword that smote with bloody execution, where he's unseamed the rebel from the knave to the chaps. We then have Macbeth and Banquo meeting the witches, and the witches being referred to instruments of darkness. Then meeting Lady Macbeth, who's described as Macbeth's dearest partner of greatness, and then we see her rejecting her femininity with her unsex me here speech, etc. So a key moment, key things, obvious moments in the play that have a pivotal action within the play and turn our character down a particular path. Notice when I was talking about those, the integration of quotations, but also symbolism that I'll talk about later on. So as my pupils as my pupils this week were completing this spell task, all independently, all in silence, when I made sure that they were okay and they didn't need my support, I turned to the whiteboard and I was able to quickly map this out. And these are things that my pupils are aware that I constantly talk about when I'm teaching Shakespeare. So, key moments. What I mean by a subtle moment is something that is less obvious and something that is not often talked about but can actually be adapted to link to all of the conceptual ideas that Shakespeare's dealing with. So a subtle moment that I always talk about happens in Act 2, Scene 1. And it's after Macbeth and Banquo have met the witches and heard the witches' prophecies. And Banquo says to Macbeth, "Last night I dreamt of the three weird sisters." Now it's one line, very matter of fact, but it's actually really important. First of all, it's symbolic of Banquo's honesty. He's not trying to hide anything. And if we think about the symbols of light and darkness that are threaded throughout the play, Banquo would definitely be in the light here, because he's not hiding anything. He hasn't got these deep and dark desires that Macbeth openly admits in his own soliloquies. The use of the term weird sisters. If we were going to zoom in on some language, the adjective weird, Banquo immediately knows that these sisters, these witches, are unnatural. He fears them. But he's also saying he has thought about them because he is human. He is being told that his sons are going to be king. Of course he's going to be thinking about that. Now the next line, Macbeth, I think not of them. Now it's two quotations that pupils will be able to easily remember, but they have got a real subtle meaning, because straight away we had two characters who were parallel with each other at the start, who'd been fighting for king and for country, and both valued, and now we start to see them veer down different paths, with Macbeth's first reaction to hearing Banquo's honesty is to be deceptive. And we can track those themes and those big ideas throughout the full play. Again, you're not going to get pupils to be able to be at this stage until you've familiarised them with those big ideas and the different stages of the play, and it's actually being chunked down for them. Another great addition to this would be to then actually apply the semantic field from earlier. So for example, where is it that Shakespeare presents Macbeth as a despot? Well, actually I could have branched that off the murder of Banquo and next to the slaughter of Macduff's family. Where could I link in the idea of patriotism? Well, I could link that back to Macbeth, the brave loyal warrior at the start, next to where he's shown bloody execution, where he's valued. Where could I talk about determination? Well, I could link that to Macbeth, but I could link that to Lady Macbeth as well. I could link that back to when Macbeth goes to see the witches again. So it's a multi-layered approach, and it's all based on retrieval at the moment. So it's retrieving the key moments from the play, but then applying that semantic field and those conceptual ideas for a deeper approach. And that links back lovely to the idea that Shakespeare's got a message. These characters are tools, that constructs to represent certain things. And Shakespeare uses these characters to show the values and criticisms of the society that he's living in. Now, this is a different approach that you can also take. So I've talked about identifying key moments and subtle moments and retrieving those moments throughout the play, and then being also able to apply conceptual ideas in a semantic field. Now we've got the idea of a character's arc and how that character changes throughout the play. And on this slide we've got two character arcs, one for Lady Macbeth and one for Macbeth. Again, it's pretty visual in the sense where if we look at the purple line, which is Lady Macbeth, the idea that she throughout the play rises in power and then she loses her power. Whereas if we look at Macbeth's, he starts the play in a powerful position, and even though he actually gains more power in the sense of him becoming king, it's unnatural. So throughout the play he's on this tragic fall, but then at the end when he realises that he's wasted his humanity and that his death's inevitable, there's a little rise there. And the way that we've done that is to then also pepper it with some killer quotations from the play, from those pivotal key moments that pupils can associate with the different ways. The reason why I've also chosen to show you this visual representation is because it's really important for pupils to be able to explain, either verbally or in their own right in an ideal world, how a character develops. It's a structural feature that Shakespeare constantly uses, and for all of his protagonists, they are not static, they change, they develop. So my third building block in terms of how to teach Shakespearean drama effectively, we've got a multi-layered approach of conceptual ideas along with the semantic field. We've got the journey of characters, and alongside that the narrative of the play. The third thing I'd like you to think about is the idea of symbolic settings. So places in a play that represent a particular thing. So if we think about Romeo and Juliet, we've got the places of Verona and Mantua. What happens in those places? What are the key moments? What big conceptual ideas could you link to those places? What areas of our semantic field could we link to those areas? And if we think of Othello, the play begins in Venice, but it ends in Cyprus. What do those places represent? And why does Shakespeare choose those places? So if we turn our attention to Macbeth in particular and consider the symbolic settings that Shakespeare utilises within this play. Well, the first setting is the desolate heath that the witches are introduced to. Why a desolate heath? Well, surely it's aligned with the fact that these are females who are marginalised in society. They are seen as wild, possibly savage, unnatural, apart from civilization. We then hear of the battlefield in Scotland, and we associate that with Jacobean masculinity, of nobility and patriotism, the place where Macbeth carves out his passage, which obviously has got connotations for later on during the play. We've got Macbeth's castle, Dunsinane, which is really important. The first time that we hear Lady Macbeth speak, and she talks about the fatal entrance of Duncan, she refers to Dunsinane as her battlements. She actually uses the phrase under my battlements. So immediately we align that character with this masculine place, and it's no coincidence that at the end of the play, it's those battlements that she falls from. We then have the royal feast that takes place within Dunsinane Castle, because Dunsinane Castle is a setting which then becomes associated with tyranny, with an abuse of power, with manipulation, with deceit, and this place which causes chaos, destruction, and ultimately suffering. Again, notice how through talking about these settings, I've gone back to key moments from the play and our character's journey, but also going back to those conceptual ideas with that semantic field that we built up around it. It's a multi-layered approach. So we have throughout this play Scotland being presented as this victim, and as a place that needs rescuing. Each new morn a new gash is added. Scotland's personified and is described as weeping and bleeding. And then we've got England, which is the place where Malcolm fled to. And in contrast to Scotland, England is displayed as this place of stability and safety, of help. Probably, most definitely, a political agenda linked to that as well. We've got Malcolm even referring to gracious England, and it's really important the fact that Malcolm returns to Scotland with 10,000 English soldiers to help restore the natural order in Scotland. So all of these places have got key moments in the play, but they've got that symbolic meaning attached to them as well. And notice so far, I haven't talked about a single quotation. We haven't talked about a specific metaphor or a particular type of imagery. It's being able to demonstrate to our pupils that Shakespeare is telling a story. There's a plot line with key moments, with characters and places, but making sure that we can expose them to those deeper meanings, what those characters, key moments, subtle moments and those places represent. And moving on, our fourth building block. So we've got conceptual ideas, semantic field, journey of a character, key moments and subtle moments, symbolic settings, and then we've got the idea of symbolism being threaded throughout Shakespeare's plays. And again, it's very similar to what we discussed last week with regards to every poem having a symbol within it and building up our pupils' confidence to be able to identify those symbols, recall the deeper meanings, and actually being able to apply symbolism in a written response. So, for example, Romeo and Juliet, we've got the symbols of the stars and the celestial beings of the sun and moon. We've got the birds with the reference to crows and a dove. We've got the symbol of poison, the balcony, the symbol of swords, and the list goes on. In Othello, we've got the symbol of the gift of Othello's handkerchief to Desdemona, which is then lost, symbolic of their relationship and their previous love. The symbol of the green-eyed monster and the net that is causing such inner turmoil to Othello, and the idea that he's now entrapped in this net. And we've got the rack, this constant torture, symbolic of the internal conflict that Iago's planted in his head, and the idea of the seed growing and growing. So we've got symbols in all of Shakespeare's plays, and I would recommend that pupils are aware of at least a few from the beginning to the end of the play, and that again, just like the concepts, the killer quotations, the key moments, they need to be constantly reviewed and talked about. They need to be embedded within your teaching and learning dialogue. So these are the symbols that are threaded throughout Macbeth that I would make sure that any of my Year 11 classes were familiar with and could apply and adapt in an exam scenario. So the first one being blood. We've got the idea of blood being first mentioned in Act 1, Scene 2, where we hear about Macbeth's sword which smoked with bloody execution, and it's very clear that Macbeth is a very physical and powerful character at the start, but there's also that hint that he is bloodthirsty, but it's okay at the start of the play because he is fighting for king and for country, and at that moment he's valued for that bloodthirsty behaviour on the battlefield. We've then got the mention of blood on the dagger that Macbeth hallucinates in Act 2, Scene 1, just before the act of regicide. And there's obviously symbolic meanings with the dagger itself, but it's that idea of blood being a consequence and an outcome of an act of sin. We then have Macbeth returning from murdering Duncan in his sleep, and the blood on Macbeth's hand is an instant symbol of guilt and regret at that stance, in that instance rather. Macbeth is scared and he can't stop looking at his hand. He refers to, will all of Neptune's ocean wash this blood away? And we've got Lady Macbeth's reaction to the blood is very logical, very matter of fact, and very rational, where she takes away the daggers and she refers to the blood as this filthy witness. We've then got throughout the play more blood being spilt. When Banquo is murdered, he's the victim of 20 gashes on his head. 20. 1 gash, 2 gash, 3 gash would have been enough to kill Banquo, but 20. When Banquo's ghost appears, we've got Macbeth say, "Don't shake thy gory locks at me," that idea that the blood is constantly there, and Macbeth is aware that he's waded in blood too deep. There's no redemption for Macbeth, there's no turning back. We've then got the slaughter of Macduff's family, some more blood being spilt. And then we've got Lady Macbeth's incredibly famous sleepwalking scene in Act 5, Scene 1, where again she refers to this idea of blood. Out damn spot. And the blood becomes a metaphor for the guilt and the suffering that the unnatural leadership of Macbeth has caused in Scotland, and caused within his own relationship as well. We've also got the contrast of the symbols of the long sword and the dagger. Really important that the first time we hear about Macbeth, he is hailed as this war hero that uses his long sword to kill Scotland's enemies. And the first thing that I always talk about with regards to the long sword is the idea that he uses the long sword to carve out his passage on the battlefield. That's obviously got metaphorical meanings for further on in the play throughout his journey, where he carves out his passage to becoming king. But the idea that he uses the long sword to unseam the revel from the knave to the chaps. And it's this bloodthirstiness, this act of regicide, that ultimately results in Macbeth being internally unseamed, because his actions have been unnatural. Now, Macbeth, at the end of the play, comes back to fighting with the long sword and goes back to fighting like this Jacobean masculine warrior. And there's a real parallel between him and Macduff. Macbeth at the start fought for king and country. Macduff at the end is fighting for the rightful king and the restoration of the natural order to Scotland, where Macbeth is fighting for his life, he's fighting for him. There's a very distinct difference. We've then got the contrast between Macbeth's long sword, this symbol of nobility, physical prowess, agility on the battlefield, nobility and patriotism, contrasting with the dagger. Now, obviously, he visualises that dagger of the hallucination of the dagger. He refers to this idea of a dagger of the mind. But if you think about the difference in sizes, okay, the dagger is a symbol of deceit. The sword is a symbol of loyalty. We've then got the crown, which symbolises absolute power in Macbeth's eye, and the fear of actually losing that power. He's constantly, as soon as he becomes king, he's then suspicious and doubts everything. He's in fear of not having a legacy, the fruitless crown. He knows that he can't have a legacy like Banquo's sons could potentially have a legacy. But then we've also got the apparitions, the child with the crown. And we've got a contrast between the natural leader and the unnatural leader. If we think about children throughout the play, children, obviously a symbol of innocence, purity, of youth, but they are the victims throughout the play. If we think about the children who were mentioned, Lady Macbeth's baby, Fleance, Macduff's family, and then we've got the apparitions. Okay, we've obviously got the first apparition, which is the armed head, but then we've got a bloody child, and then we've got the child with the crown and the root. Also, the idea of children glowing and blossoming link lovely to not the symbolism that's threaded throughout, but the symbolism of Banquo being referred to as this root and this seed. And then we've got the symbol of light and dark. Darkness is threaded all the way throughout this play. Lady Macbeth requests thick blood, come thick night, and it's symbolic for the act of regicide, the act of deceit, looking like the innocent flower but acting like the serpent under it. And at the end, it is no surprise that Lady Macbeth is completely aware that her damnation is going to be internal darkness. She talks of the fact that hell is murky, but she has that candle by her side. So these symbols are threaded throughout, and again, you could go back to the character's journey. Where are these symbols? In what order, in what sequence are they presented to us in an audience? Why? Why are we introduced with the longsword and blood first? Okay, why does it end with darkness and the reference to the candle, out brief candle? What conceptual ideas can you link to the symbols? What semantic field can you link to the symbols? And again, it's adding that multi-layered approach to one of Shakespeare's dramas. And the fifth building block, so parallel and contrasting characters. So we've got conceptual ideas, we've got a semantic field, we've got a character journey, we've got key moments, subtle moments, character arcs, we've got symbolic settings, we've got the threading of symbolism throughout, we've now got parallel and contrasting characters. So as previously stated, it's really important for our pupils to be completely aware that characters are included in a piece of Shakespearean drama to represent a big idea, to symbolise a certain element of society, to be valued and to be criticised, potentially both, and that they are constructs of Shakespeare. They are created for an effect, not just to tell a story. There are a lot more than that. And we need our pupils to go beyond the text and see the text as something that's being constructed, and see these characters as having voices and choices. So an easy route into that idea of a character as a construct is thinking about, well, which characters contrast or parallel? Why are they similar or different? What do they represent? So, for example, the witches obviously contrast with the majority of the characters, but there are some parallels. So we're introduced to the witches at first. They are obviously supernatural beings, and they seem to have an unnatural power, something higher than the power of mankind, the power of humanity. We then link the witches to Lady Macbeth, undoubtedly in Act 1, Scene 5, where she calls on these murdering ministers, and it's very obvious that she is also monstrous like them. We can then also link the witches to Banquo's ghost, this element of supernatural. But at the same time, we can contrast the witches and Banquo's ghost, because Banquo never became an instrument of their darkness. He didn't allow himself to be manipulated by them like Macbeth did. We then got Lady Macduff, who completely contrasts to Lady Macbeth. They are at the two complete different ends of femininity. We've got Lady Macduff, who embraces her position in Jacobean society, whose role is ultimately a wife and a mother, as a protector of her children. And in complete contrast, we've got Lady Macbeth, who rejects that maternal instincts. She doesn't want milk in her breast, she wants gall. But also it's important to think about the contexts of those characters. Is Lady Macbeth this monstrous woman because she can't have a child and there's no place for her to be in society other than following a different route? And again, we can think back to the witches and think, well, they're both marginalised in some ways. We've then got the characters, say, of Macbeth and Macduff, who at the start are parallel to each other. They are both thanes, they are loyal, they are noble to the King of Scotland. But then as the play goes on and Macbeth becomes consumed by ambition and power for himself, Macduff remains loyal to the rightful heir, Malcolm. Also, Macduff's final actions in the play of executing Macbeth reminds us of the actions of Macbeth at the start of the play. So again, there are parallels drawn between characters. We've then got three kings in this play. We've got the first king, King Duncan, who is valued, who's a good man, but he's too trusting. That's his fatal flaw. We've then got Macbeth, who's the next king, whose fatal flaw is that he's consumed by power and ambition and greed for this power, and he loses his humanity. And then we've got Malcolm, who's going to learn from the mistakes of his father. He is not going to be too trusting. and he's going to restore the natural order to Scotland. So, why are characters similar or different? Well, it's because they represent big ideas, they represent concepts. Shakespeare is using these characters as constructs to say something about society. He values Macduff, it's incredibly obvious. He values Malcolm, but he also uses Malcolm to show the intricacies and the consequences of kingship. An additional task would be obviously applying these parallel and contrasting characters, creating a mind map of them all, but then layering them up again, drawing on the conceptual ideas, the semantic fields, killer quotations, the symbols. Can you link the symbol of the sword to more than one character? Well, yeah, you could link it to Duncan, you could link it to Macbeth, you could link it to Banquo, you could link it to Macduff. You could link it to Lady Macduff and their child, because they are ultimately victims of the sword. So there's so many things that you can do with the idea of characterisation within Macbeth and within all of Shakespeare's plays. Another image that I've included is something that I always use to get my pupils to think about evolving and widening relationships in a play. So you've got characters who are along the same route, and then they veer in different directions. So for example, this could equally apply to, I forgot my words there. This could equally apply to Othello and Desdemona. At the start of the play, when they are in Venice, they are going down the same path of love and trust. But then as soon as they get to Cyprus, and as soon as Othello allows Iago to manipulate him, just like Macbeth allows the witches and Lady Macbeth to manipulate them, both Othello and Macbeth, they're physically strong, but they're internally weak. And then they go down different paths. Again, if we use this image to think about Macbeth and Banquo, going down the same route, victorious from battle, meet the witches and go down different routes, and their relationship evolves. Macbeth lies to him, the relationship widens, Macbeth becomes suspicious, realises that he's played most foully for it, and their relationship ultimately ends. As well, we could also apply this image to Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, how at the start of the play, Macbeth views his wife as his partner, his equal, my dearest partner of greatness. But then as the play develops, once he's become king, their relationship widens, it evolves in a negative way. So our sixth building block. Concept, semantic field, character's journey, character arcs, key moments, subtle moments, symbolic settings, threading of symbolism, parallel and contrasting characters, and we have killer quotations. Now I purposefully haven't mentioned quotations and language up until this point because it is the main obstacle that pupils nationally across all ages and abilities seem to struggle with regarding Shakespeare. They see it as old English, not as poetry. And the reason why I've talked about all of the other building blocks first is because those building blocks should build confidence and expose pupils to the fact that it's not about the words written on the page. Well, obviously it is, because that's what Shakespeare created, but it's more three-dimensional than that. It's not just about keywords or phrases or metaphors, and exposing them to the other building blocks will hopefully make sure that they do not see language is as much as a barrier as they would have. First thing that I want to make really apparent is that it's okay to not understand every word. Pupils need to be aware that it's okay for them to not understand every word. If I went to see Titus Andronicus, for example, that's a play that I've never read or studied. If I went to see that, I would not understand every word. That's okay. And the way that I use killer quotations, in particular for Shakespeare, is to choose quotations that are linked to conceptual ideas, key pivotal moments, and symbolism throughout the play. And they are quotations that I embed in my teaching and learning dialogue whenever I am talking about the play to build familiarity. And like it just says on here, key exam tip, you want to really choose quotations that are adaptable. So for example, if I was given a question on ambition, I could apply, "Oh, full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife," because the scorpion is a consequence of Macbeth's ambition. He has replaced the loyalty and nobility and patriotism that he had at the start with these poisonous thoughts that were initially drip fed to him from the witches and from Lady Macbeth. And at that moment in the play, in Act 3, there is no room for anything else in his mind. He is being internally poisoned throughout his quest for power and ambition. I would also talk about the phrase "dear wife," because it links to his relationship with Lady Macbeth, and it links with how his relationship has evolved in a negative way. Their relationship has widened as a result of ambition. So I'm bringing it back to ambition. However, if I was given a question on deceit, I could also use that quotation. The scorpion is a consequence of Macbeth's deceit because he was fueled by ambition. So you want to choose quotations that A, are easily remembered by your pupils, B, that you integrate into your everyday teaching and learning pedagogy, but 3, that are adaptable to all of the big ideas and are interchangeable with different semantic fields. I'm not going to go through and model how to obviously explode a quotation. I know that you know how to do that. But a few techniques that you could use is, when exploding quotations, make sure that we link them to characters, obviously, but then also consider the idea of parallel and contrasting quotations. There's a great resource in the English literature recipe book for perfect pairings. You can also map them out on your character journey and your character arcs. You can link them to settings and places. You can link them to conceptual ideas and the semantic field. And our final building block on how to teach Shakespearean drama: transferable phrases. Now, there is a section in the English literature recipe book on transferable phrases for all of the literature texts at Key Stage 4. But to really simplify it, a transferable phrase is something that can be transferred into every essay. So it's very similar to the killer quotations from an adaptability perspective. There we go, got there in the end. So our transferable phrases, we need to be able to transfer them to talking about different conceptual ideas, different extracts, different characters, but they can transfer and slot into a response beautifully. So this slide, it just shows you how I have tracked 3 big ideas, concepts from the play, and around them I have just noted down some of the phrases that I always say about Macbeth when I'm talking about it. If you came in to see my year 11s at Walbottle at the moment, they would probably say the thing that I say the most at the moment is, there is no redemption for the Macbeths once they commit regicide, only damnation. Okay, so it's that idea that that sentence can be transferred as an explanation, as a link, as a point for a wide range of things. Now, to build this up even further, you could then create some golden examples for your pupils. So, after they've produced a piece of writing, I would then give a golden example, and what I mean by a golden example is a perfect peel on that same response, but that is also embedded with transferable phrases. So things that they can transfer, pick out of your golden example and use to recycle in their own work, but which also refines and perfects their own work. And you'll see that on the next slide, I have included a golden example for you to look at. And that brings us to the end of this Interpreting Shakespeare and How to Teach It follow-up session. So I'm really hoping that I've been able to provide you with some teaching takeaway tips that you can immediately think about, reflect upon your practice, embed them into your current teaching and learning, and adapt as you go. So we started off recalling Shakespeare and his big ideas, the importance of breaking down the fact that Shakespeare was a man with a voice, and the outcome, the plays that we study, are evidence of that, and try and remove our pupils from thinking that Shakespeare is this monumental, mammoth person that oversees all of literature, even though he really does. And also thinking about conceptual ideas and building up a semantic field. Just want to reiterate again at this point that it's incredibly important that those conceptual ideas and the semantic field is constantly reviewed and revisited, and we give opportunities for retrieval and opportunities for our pupils to test their memory. We've got to provide them with that. We then looked at the journey of a character or characters. We looked at symbolic settings. We looked at the threading of symbolism throughout Shakespeare's plays, how we can move away from just what a character does and says, but then think about, well, what do these characters represent? How do they parallel and contrast each other? Thinking about language analysis and killer quotations, and then finally transferable phrases. I really hope that this session wasn't as long as my last poetry one, guys. Apologies if it is. It's just when you're recording yourself and talking about it, you actually lose track of time. You don't realise how long you've been talking for. So if it is long, I apologise. But please pause it and go back and revisit the things when it's an appropriate time. And please remember the plethora of resources that we do have at Northern Education Trust within the English departments. So we've got our recipe books, we've got the Net English YouTube channel, there's a whole playlist dedicated to Macbeth and Romeo and Juliet on there, so please check them out. There's also the quotation cards that our pupils have at GCSE. Just to be really even more specific within the recipe book, the lit flips and the protagonist profiles are incredibly useful as well. And as always, if you've got any questions, please speak to your link director, or please feel free to drop me an email at a.potts@northerneducationtrust.org. God, nearly forgot my own email there. If there's anything else that you'd like, if you would like some evidence, some example lessons of using one of those layered approaches, please let me know. Photographs of what a pupil's book might look like after producing a piece of work, using one of those building blocks, anything, let me know.